Hey first grade readers, I want to let you know Mr. Moskowitz, Mrs. Nelson, and myself know that you have been doing really hard work studying each and every one of the books you've been reading carefully to one, keep track of what's happening in the story, to get to know the characters in the story really well, and also learn lessons from these characters in the books that you're reading. I know that you're ready to kick it up a notch and take on some new challenges as we finish up this reading unit. Are you ready for it? Yes, I knew you would be. This is really advanced, really fancy, very sophisticated, like college work that I'm gonna have you be doing today. I know you're probably saying, Mrs. Gummo, don't forget, we're still in first grade, but I know you can turn your brains on really high and do this work. So ready? Turn those brains up, knobs up, brains up, maybe shake your head around to get it ready. And so today, readers, I want to teach you that readers don't just read books. Readers don't just think about characters and life lessons. Readers also compare and contrast books. They think, what's the same and what's different? So to get our brains doing this really fancy, really sophisticated way of thinking, I am going to show you how grown-ups compare and contrast things or think what's the same and what's different between two things. First, you start with those two things that are kind of sort of alike. So I have these shoes of mine, and I also have this pair of shoes. These pair of shoes, I should say. I'm going to take one of each because, well, yeah, they are kind of the same because they're both shoes, right? So now let's think about, how are these the same? Go ahead, shout out an answer, first grade readers. They're shoes. Did I hear someone say that they're gray or, well, grayish silver? Yeah, they kind of are. They're kind of the same color. What else is the same about them? We would wear them on our feet. Yes. Anything else you want to say that's the same? They both come in pairs. They both have two. Yes. Great comparing, readers. When you're comparing something, you think about what's the same. Now let's do some work with contrasting these two things. Contrast to notice things that are different. What's different about these two shoes? One has a high heel and one's flat. One's fancy, one's a sneaker. Yes. What else is different? Did I hear you say this has ties and this doesn't? It has a little clip here, but no ties on it. What else are different? This has open toes and this does not. Great job, first graders. You are doing some pretty fancy work. Readers do that same kind of work when they think about two books that are kind of the same. You ready to give it a try? All right. I know that you and I read the book Iris and Walter and the Field Trip. And we've started reading some stories from Frog and Toad, our friends. Well, we're going to read another book. And as we read this story rather, from Frog and Toad, as we read, I want you to be thinking about what happens, how the characters feel and behave, and how the stories end, so that you can think back to the stories after and compare and contrast them. When we do that, we're thinking, what are some things that are the same and what are some things that are different? Here we go. A lost button. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last, they went back home to Toad's house. Oh, drat, said Toad. Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket. Ooh, that makes me think of how Walter gets lost in Iris and Walter. Don't worry, said Frog. We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button. They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. Here is your button, cried Frog. That is not my button, said Toad. That button is black. My button was white. Toad put the black button in his pocket. I'm thinking the same thing, readers, that's very similar to Iris and Walter in that Iris had to go back with the teacher to find Walter. A sparrow flew down. Excuse me, said the sparrow. Did you lose a button? I found one. That is not my button, said Toad. That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes. Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. Here is your button, said Frog. That is not my button, cried Toad. That button is small. My button was big. Toad put the small button in his pocket. Let's pause there for a second, readers, and do some thinking. What else have you noticed is the same about Frog and Toad and maybe Iris and Walter? Frog and Toad are friends just like Iris and Walter. Ooh, that kind of makes me think of Upstairs Mouse and Downstairs Mole. They're friends too. Oh, look at us. We're comparing and contrasting 3 different books. I'm thinking the same thing. It is different because they didn't look for, Iris and their teacher didn't find other people that they were looking for. They just found Walter. So this is different in that way. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. I heard that you were looking for a button, he said. Here is one that I just found. That is not my button, wailed Toad. That button is square. My button was round. Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. Here is your button, said Frog. That is not my button, shouted Toad. That button is thin. My button was thick. Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine. What did you say? Yeah, I know. That is silly. He has really strong emotions in that part. But yes, you're right. Just like the strong emotions that are in Upstairs Mouse and Downstairs Mole when they have those strong emotions about the way they're feeling about each other's food. Good thinking, first graders. Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor, he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. Oh, said Toad. It was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog. What are you noticing, first graders? That's the same about this book in Iris and Walter. Well, you're right. The button really was in the same place the entire time. Very similar to Walter being in the same place when Iris went looking for him. I'm thinking the same thing too, that now, it just like in Upstairs Mouse and Downstairs Mole, Frog has realized he's made a big problem for Toad. And he wants to make it right, I'm thinking. Just like Upstairs Mouse and Downstairs Mole, Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Excuse me. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. And that's the end of that story of Frog and Toad are friends, readers. You are doing fantastic fantastic work, and I'm going to go send you off to do some reading on your own. Remember, when you're comparing and contrasting your books, you're thinking about what's the same and what is different. When you're comparing, you might just compare the setting in each story. You might compare the characters' feelings in the stories, or you might compare and contrast the trouble in the stories. You can even think about how the trouble gets fixed to discover ways books are similar. And then when you go off and talk about it or do this thinking, you can think, this is just like this book because, and then you just keep on reading, just like we did there. Have a great day reading, readers. I'll see you soon.